Hey kids team, welcome back to one of our sessions where we go through our curriculum to help us learn a little bit more about these stories and help us teach them really well in our programs. So I'm here with Pastor Jo, or just Jo, and I'm Trea, and we're going to be going through our first story for term 2. So we're going to be going through God made a covenant with Abraham from Genesis 12 through to 20.
Yes.
Because there's quite a lot here.
Yes. And I don't think the curriculum actually covers all of that distance. There's a lot going on in this, which we won't touch on all of today.
Yes.
We'll predominantly just look at the covenant conversation that happens in this section, because that's the big thing that the curriculum's pulling out. There's a whole lot of stuff about, like, why did Abraham pass off his wife as his sister when they went to
questions,
which we're not going to touch on today. You can listen to our Bible Streams podcast to get a real deep dive on that.
But highly suggest that.
Yeah, this will help you get your head around the covenant stuff, which the curriculum is going to look at.
Yeah, so. Great. So we have a new big
Things
question.
have changed.
Yes, things have changed from last term. We're starting with a new big question and a new memory verse as well. So let's hit with our big question. It is, who is in control of everything?
Great question.
Oh, the answer?
God.
God.
God is,
so let's make that really clear when teaching our kids that God is the answer to that question.
Yep.
But as we get into this story, let's start where we always start. Why?
Memory verse. New memory verse 2.
Sorry, we are going to be doing a new memory verse as well. So our curriculum does suggest that we do Psalm 135, but because we want to have the same memory verse for the whole term, we've actually chosen to use the memory verse from the second unit that we go into this term, which is some of our Moses stories. So we're going to be doing Numbers, which is Numbers 23. Numbers 23:19. God is not man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. He has said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? So that really leads us well into the promises and the covenants that are made in this season. So we're going to use the NIV for our memory verse as well.
Yeah, that wasn't the NIV.
No, I was going to say that I do not recognize this. This is the ESV. So we'll use the NIV. Sorry about that, guys. But so our big question, who is in control of everything? God is. But first of all, why is this story in our Bibles, Jo?
Well, it's a great segue because God is in control of everything, and so we see the change now. So everything that we covered last term, everything that's happened up till Genesis chapter 12 is kind of that prehistory part of a Genesis storyline, and so things change significantly at chapter 12. So we've covered a huge span of time, we've covered a huge span of people and events, and it hasn't gone into a whole lot of detail. It's slowed down here and there, but not for any significant period of time. Now the pace changes completely.
Yes.
And so now we're going to get multiple chapters, 10 plus chapters on each person. So the pace slows down and the detail increases because the interface changes essentially. So those first 11 chapters, we've been looking at God's promise to humanity, that he'll bless them, that he'll give them descendants, that he'll give them a place.
Yep.
And we've seen humanity struggle with trying to do that themselves. So they've been attempting to kind of establish that covenant, and sin has been the result of humans' attempt to do God's thing their way. And so it's gone from bad to worse. And we've seen the spread of sin from the first people to the first family to all people, to actually breaking down society and culture, which we saw right through people trying to, instead of letting God make a name for them, people have decided to try and make a name for themselves. So all of that kind of ends when we get to the end of chapter 11, where we get this big, what's called the Table of Nations, which kind of lays out a whole bunch of different nations, crafted carefully so the first hearers would understand, oh, this is where all the local tribes and nations have all come from.
Yeah.
And then we get introduced to a single family right at the end of chapter 11, and then we get introduced to a new person, Abram. In the first verse of chapter 12. So as the first hearers are hearing this is the first significant figure of the covenant story. So after the first people, it's regularly spoken through the Old Testament, through the Hebrew Bible, that he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah.
And so when the first hearers are hearing the story of Abraham, they know, oh, this is where the real relationship starts.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what they're thinking when they first hear it. And the first thing that happens to Abraham is God essentially initiates a covenant with him, which is Pretty cool and pretty wild, because people have been trying to get themselves to God, and then God, because he is in control, he initiates a covenant with humans. So this is where we get the initial instance of what we call election, where God chooses, he elects to choose someone, he elects to pick someone that he will work with and through and for, and Abraham and then all of his descendants become that.
And now when we're talking about covenant, I know in our curriculum, it quite often also uses the word promise, that God keeps his promises. Do you think that's an appropriate word to kind of have in there to help kids understand covenant?
Yeah, I think so. That helps. Promises are kind of the outworking of covenant, and so it's kind of essentially the consequences of what happens when you keep a covenant. And so I think that works well to help people understand that God has asked us to have this relationship and arrangement with him, and because of us being a part of that, we receive the blessing of his promises. And so that's a good way, I think, to help particularly the younger kids start to get their head around it. Covenants themselves are very interesting and complex thing in the Bible. Let's read out the actual covenant that God initiates first in Genesis 12. So it says this in verse 1. I'm again reading from the ESV. You might be reading from something else. That's okay. It says, "Now the Lord said to Abram," not Abraham,
still Abram,
"Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all families of the earth shall be blessed." So you get these three verses that really straight away bring those three main themes that we've been talking about already. So he's going to a new land. You're going to find a new land. I will make your name great. And remember, just back in Tower of Babel, people are trying to make their own name great. God's going, I'm going to make your name great, which was understood to mean you will have a legacy, that a family will come and you will be remembered, which happens. Spoilers, by the time we get to Jesus, they're still talking about Abraham.
His name's pretty great.
We're talking about him today. And he said, I will bless you and you'll be a blessing to others. And so this idea of blessing and place and family all really comes through quite strongly. What's really interesting about covenants is there's a whole lot of different covenants, and there's covenants where both parties agree to it and both parties have responsibilities, and should one of the parties or both not keep their responsibilities, then the covenant is dissolved. And so they're conditional covenants. God here makes an unconditional covenant. He doesn't say anything is expected of Abraham.
No.
He just says, this is what I'm going to do. So he makes a promise to Abraham in the form of this covenant, this legal agreement, and because of that, something will happen. Can we get a little bit Bible nerdy?
Yes,
great.
Go for it.
So, contextually nerdy. In the ancient Near East, so that's the context of Abraham's life, and by the time we get to the first hearers, it's kind of the tail end of the ancient Near East, and it's becoming kind of closer to the time of Jesus. So probably the 400-500s before Christ, when they're coming back from exile and starting to really collate all this together and really pay attention to how do we get ourselves here and why has this gone poorly. So as they're thinking back to this time, particularly at the time of Abraham, and you see it through his life, there's constantly kings taking over land and taking on what they call vassals, which is kind of not slaves, but people who will serve them, who have their own standing. Sometimes they're important people and they become like a sub-king. Sometimes they're actually just a people group and they will serve that king. And so there's what's called a suzerain vassal treaty. There you go. Bonus points for those who remember how to spell that.
I've already forgotten.
Suzerain being this kind of high king, this overruler, overlord kind of thing, and the vassal being those who are... It's usually between an invading force and the existing people in that country. And so when they take over, they don't want to kill off everyone because then they've got no one to do all the work.
Yes.
So they go, we're going to make an arrangement, and I will protect you, and I will give you worth and meaning and give you a safe place, and then you will support me through taxes or food or whatever those things. And so there's this powerful party who comes to a less powerful party and makes some promises, and then they promise to do this thing too. And that's kind of the pattern we see through most of the Old Testament, particularly when we get to the book of Deuteronomy. It's essentially set up, one way of viewing it is it's actually written out like one of these treaties from the ancient world. And there's examples where it follows pretty much the same structure. And so there's this idea that God, being the powerful one who is in control, comes to the less powerful Abram, who doesn't really know anything or anyone. He's never even really heard of this God before. And he says, I'm the all-powerful one. Why don't you come and I'll be your king and you'll be my vassal and you'll represent me to places and you'll live out my values here and I'll protect you and I'll bless you and I'll do all those things. And
in this story, there's some challenges in this covenant that's been made because Abram, he is married to Sarai. Is that how you would say it? Yep. And she has so far not had any children.
Yes.
And is maybe viewed to not be able to have children, which barren is a word that's used. She is yet to have children and is getting older and older and maybe past her childbearing years.
Yes.
And yet it says that I am going to bless you.
Exactly.
And all people will come from you.
I'll make of you a great nation.
A great nation. And so we have this covenant that's been made that seems to be a little confusing. And we do see Abram at times maybe make some mistakes within that.
Well, try
to bring about the covenant himself.
One of the helpful things that I think you should probably avoid doing with the kids is not making too many kind of moral lessons out of this, because we're not studying so much the character of Abram or Abraham later. We're actually studying the character of God and his blessings to us. So Abraham, and Abram as he is first, is a flawed character like every single person is in Scripture except for Jesus. And so he at times lies. At times he takes matters into his own hands. He says, well, God's promised this, so if he's promised it, then I'll work myself into the outcome of that. So God says, I'll make you a great nation. His wife's barren. She's 90. He's 100. It says...
They're getting on.
In beautiful poetry, the bodies were too old to produce offspring. And so he says, well, that's fine. I've got this concubine, this servant girl.
Yes.
I will, as was the custom in the ancient Near East, not saying, again, polygamy is not endorsed by this. It's saying he would do what was the custom, fresh out of this kind of pagan nation, this Gentile nation, wherever he was, and says, well, I will have a child through my servant, and then that will be one of my offspring, and so that will be how this thing continues. Not knowing that God, as we find out later in Romans 4, God can do miracles and God can call things that aren't as though they are, and Abraham, who was essentially counted as barren and dead, no generations, God does a miracle and brings descendants out of it.
And what I love in that, the kind of, as we look at God in this, as we travel through the story of Abram and who becomes Abraham, we actually do see God repeat this covenant to him time and time again, just to remind him or to continue to tell him. So Joe's given us some great references here, but he repeats it again in Genesis 12, 13, 15, 17, and then Isaac is born in 21.
That's the next session, so next 12.
We won't go there.
And it's quite often after a significant thing happens. So after Abraham and Lot, who's his nephew, who's also possibly a means to this great nation, after they separate, God reiterates his covenant to him. After there's this really weird incident where Abraham, who's probably, if you read between the lines a little bit, not reading into the text, but reading the context of it, when 5 kings and their armies come up to fight against 4 kings and all of their armies, and it's all going on, and Abraham comes in and stops the fight with his army. It's quite possible that Abraham's probably the biggest warlord and power broker in the region, and he's actually enough to scare off 9 armies.
He does seem to have quite a lot of stuff as we travel through.
He's quite the person.
He seems to get stuff quite often.
He's the power broker in the whole region. And so you can imagine it's quite unsettling for everyone as this new, essentially, private army walks into their land and goes, I'm here now and my God told me that this is for me. And so he's blessed, and then there's a reiteration of the covenant in chapter 15, which is a wonderfully weird section to read. Abraham falls asleep and this blazing pot of fire does figure eights, and it's wild and crazy, which is really interesting again. Genesis. I know, right? Then you get chapter 17, which after the whole incident with Abraham and his handmaid, his servant girl, God reiterates the covenant again. It's like, then we get the promise of Isaac being born to Abraham, an actual legitimate son from his wife. And so there's those reiterations of covenant when it seems to be like the wheels are falling off. God steps back in and goes, don't forget. And also, as we were discussing before, there's a significant period of time between all of these things. So there's 10 years between, at least 10 years between when Abraham first hears that call of God and when Isaac is born.
Yes.
And there's a whole incident with laughter and Sarah laughing and all this kind of stuff. So worth reading through the chapters to get your head around the bigger story, but really pay attention to what God's doing in the midst of it, because that's a really key part. And that's what the first hearers would have been hearing, is that, even this flawed, broken human person, God's deciding to work now on his behalf. And even when he gets it wrong, God continues to work to draw him back to the right way of living, the right way of representing God into the world. So,
and these stories are really about God's faithfulness to his promises. So we don't want you to get caught up in Ishmael's story with Hagar. We don't want you to get caught up in circumcision and talking to children about that.
Be sensitive about those things.
Or that Abraham says his wife is his sister a couple of times. In fact, that seems to be a bit of a family trait along the line.
It happens.
But these are not the things about this story that we, as Joe said earlier, we're not studying Abraham per se, but who God is and who God is in these stories as we travel through. We're going to do a character a week, pretty much in ministry for the next term. So what we're seeing is God is faithful. God is keeping his promises or his covenant. And so as we head into there, was there anything else that is really important for us before actually jumping in and teaching this to kids?
Probably the one thing that kids will ask, and I think it's a really good thing to talk about, is that why does his name change from Abram to Abraham?
Great.
Which happens kind of around chapter 17 when the covenant is reiterated. And so the whole idea is that and you're probably aware of some of these things. It happens throughout Scripture that names are quite significant in Scripture, and names are quite connected to purpose or calling or destiny or life situation or God's promises in the midst of that. And so when Abram, which means exalted father, and it says earlier, I will make you a great nation, he's like, well, I'm an exalted father, but then when God reiterates the covenant in 17 and makes him to be called Abraham, that moves from exalted father to the father of many.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing the covenant being now born out in Abraham's identity. So you were important, but now you're actually going to be the covenant carrier in that sense. And so you see that shift. And same with Sarah, Sarai to Sarah. It's this idea that Sarah and Sarai both mean the same thing, which is princess, and that makes sense to go with the exalted father. But there's also the idea that if God's name is Yahweh, there's the Ha is part of God's name, and so he's actually kind of bringing a bit of his identity into their life as well. So hence the change from I's and M's to H's and that kind of thing, which is one of the theories about how that works. So a lot of people have opinions, but I think definitely understanding and helping the kids understand that names speak to purpose, and when God changes a name, there's something significant about that, which we'll get to when we get to Jacob. Yes. Because Jacob's name gets changed as well.
Spoilers.
So that's one thing to remember. Also, again, Abraham's not overly obedient to begin with. He's pretty slow to actually respond to God. It's a pretty big deal. And you can imagine, put yourself in his shoes, and this might be something to talk to with the kids as well. God shows up pretty much out of the blue and just says, hey, go. And he's like, whoa, hang on. So he goes a little way, he packs up his whole family. Like, there's a pretty laborious process. Things like famine happen where he has to go to Egypt and he has to deal with all of these kind of circumstances. It's quite the journey, and actually starting to help people prepare that the journey of faith is a lifelong journey, and Abraham portrays that beautifully. I think that's really a significant thing. There's all sorts of other stuff to talk about. I think the real key part is that we start to understand that God's promises are dependent not on human obedience, but on God's character. And Abraham is a beautiful illustration of that.
And I think that's where we want to head with our kids as well. It's that our big question is who's in control of everything, and bringing them back to the fact that God is in control of everything. But there's some great things we can do to introduce this story this week, because coming out of this story, I think what you want to be talking about is that God is following through on what he says. What God says he'll do because
Yeah.
he keeps his promises. So it's more sometimes doing activities as we lead into a story rather than as we come out of them, because sometimes as we come out of them, that's when the really good discussion can happen. So you're better off to do your kind of fun things as you lead into something. So like a really great game to play in this is maybe giving the kids a bowl of rice and asking them to count it. Because the fact is, you know, he would
So
have
mean.
to send it as many as the stars. And just imagine
Sand on the seashore.
how overwhelming that would feel to the children, and helping them understand this is what God promised to Abraham, and he had no children at the time. Like, that's such a overwhelming thing. Or Abraham goes on quite the journey, and so you can play those games like where you put pieces of paper down on the floor and the kids can only take the yellow ones to get to the other side of the room, or only take the blue ones to get to the other side of the room, just so they can start to understand the journey that he goes on, and that it's not always a straight path, that sometimes things take time and things can be hard. But we have some really great questions actually in our curriculum for this story. I don't always like the questions in the curriculum, but on this one I actually really do. So they're questions like, why can we trust God? And why did it take great faith for Abraham to trust God and believe his promises? Because here we have someone who's been promised something by God, but it's not looking like that would be an easy effort to have a child when they're in their old age and supposedly barren. And that, you know, a great nation would come from him. And even then, when he only has one child, even thinking that when you only have one child, and we see
It's not a great nation, it's one child.
it's just one child. And so these are really great questions. And the last question is, how do you respond when you learn something about God? And asking our kids, how do you feel to know that God keeps his promises? Because our kids go through some really hard stuff, and for them to know that God is good, that God has good plans for them, and that he keeps his promises is a really important part of the foundation of their faith. And so maybe they want to share with you what they feel about God. Our children don't always feel positively about God if they're going through something hard. And that could be something as simple as their pet is sick, or they didn't do well at school, and then they start to put those hard feelings onto God. So it's a great opportunity to talk with our kids about, look, how time and time again God spoke to Abraham and reiterated his promise and reminded him that what he was going to do, and we see him do it. And so that's a really great way to talk with our kids about this story.
Yeah, I think you can roll that then into that beautiful Christ connection is like, God promised Abraham he'd be with him and bless him, then Jesus promises he'll be with us.
Yes.
It's the same God making the same promises that he'll be with us always. So yeah,
I love that. Well, we hope that helps you understand Abraham and the story of Abraham. Obviously, that's a lot of chapters to go over, which is why we've been a little bit longer in this one, because we want to make sure we understand that what we're talking about before we go in and teach this story. So I hope that's been helpful. Thanks.